It's really hard for me to believe that we are halfway through March already, and I have not yet come here to chat with you all about the books that I read in February, which ones I loved, which ones I hated, which ones I did not finish. The beginning of March was just a really busy time for me, and I didn't really have the wherewithal to sit down and record one of these videos. That is all about to change. I am going to be diving into my February reads, the books that I read last month, and I'm going to tell you all about them. Welcome back to the Book Nook. I'm Valerie. I read books. Sometimes I write them. Before we dive into the books that I read in February, I want to tell you about a very exciting project that I am a part of and how you can help us get this project off the ground. For those of you who may be new to the Nook, you may not know that I am a writer. I have published several books and short stories, and this summer I have a new short story coming out in a short story anthology. The theme is centered around claw machines. When the editor reached out to me about this project, I was like, I don't know. I've never played a claw machine. I don't really have any ideas. And then of course, Brain did what Brain does, which is think and sit and mull over this tiny obscure idea. And in the end, I came up with a story idea, pitched it to the editor, she loved it, and it's going to be published in an anthology with I think 15 or 16 other authors. It is scheduled to come out in June, and right now we are funding the project through Kickstarter. Kickstarter is a great way for small authors or indie presses to really crowdsource the funding to launch a project like this one. As I'm recording this, we are $60 away from funding the project, and we would love to see it funded. We would love to reach our stretch goal. The money is going towards the publication of the project. It does cost money to print and design and edit your own books. The money will also be going to pay the authors who have stories in the anthology, as well as to pay the editor who is putting the anthology together. There are ebooks available, paperback copies, signed paperback copies, and some fun little add-ons. So if you want to check out that Kickstarter project and be a part of creating a short story anthology, check out the link down below. I will post it there. See if it's something you would be interested in. And if you do participate, thank you. Thank you so much. I managed somehow to read 8 books this month. Last month. In January, I read 4. In February, I doubled that number, which kind of blows my mind because February is obviously a shorter month. And also, I cannot say the word February very well. February. I want to put like an extra R in there. February. There we go. That's so lovely. February. I still can't say it. Well, I am going to start with the books that I did not like. We're just gonna get those out of the way as soon as possible and move into the books that I did like and would recommend. But first, the 3 books that I really didn't like last month, they were all part of the mystery genre, so it is possible that I'm just kind of a little bit burned out on mystery novels right now because I'm not finding them very fulfilling at the moment. I do love the mystery genre. It is one of my favorites, but sometimes I read too many of them and I need to take a break, and that may be where I'm at, but also I just don't think these books were very good, objectively. A Jewel in the Crown by David Lewis is a nominee for the Edgar Awards for the Best Debut. I'm not going to dive too much into why I didn't like this book. There will be another video coming out in the future. Oh my gosh, hopefully if I can get it together. Long story short, I didn't really like this one. We have a spy who is recruited by Churchill to safeguard the crown jewels to try and get them somewhere safe during World War II. She is paired with another spy and they are pretending to be married, and they go on this little road trip across England with the crown jewels. It just felt very uneven in tone in terms of whether it was supposed to be a serious World War II novel or like a hijinks novel. It just didn't sit well with me for a lot of reasons. I didn't really like the main character. There was some blatantly racist dialogue that did not contribute to the storyline, to the plot, to the characters, was not addressed in a very careful, thoughtful way, and there were a lot of plot holes. When I finished it, I was very disappointed that I hadn't DNF'd it, that I had seen it all the way through. It left me feeling just kind of blah and icky about reading and about this genre and about the Edgar Award nominees for this year. This was the first book that was on the short list, and we did not get off to a very good start. And in fact, I picked up another Edgar Award nominee for Best Debut, Twice the Trouble by Ash Clifton. I was hoping this one would be a little bit better for me. It started out okay. This is a book about a private investigator who is recruited by a questionable lawyer to find a missing person. And this is set in Florida. It was giving me Bad Monkey vibes, which I was enjoying for a little bit. And then the main character just really devolved into somebody that I could no longer root for. His treatment of women was not great. His aptitude as a private investigator, his skills, also not great. I got to page 117 in this book and bailed on it. And again, I'll talk more about this book in a different video, but this one was not a good pick for me in February. Did not like this book. Will not be revisiting it anytime soon. Probably wouldn't pick up another book by this author either in the future. I just don't think his style is what I'm looking for in my reading life. I just don't think he's writing for me. You know what I mean? I read one more book last month that I didn't like, and this one was a little bit of a heartbreak for me because I went into it really wanting to like it. To be fair, I go into every book wanting to like it. I really try hard to be a generous reader. I really try hard to allow the author space to write characters that I don't particularly like or have them do things that I don't particularly agree with. For about half of the book, I absolutely loved it, and then it fell apart, and so it went in my bottom pile in the do not recommend section of this video. That book is City Under One Roof by Iris Yamashita. The beginning part of it was so good. I absolutely loved the setting. We are in a remote town in Alaska that I think is loosely based off of an existing town, Whittier, maybe? Don't quote me on that. In this town, there is pretty much one building where everybody lives in kind of this big condo. There are a couple of restaurants and a couple of businesses. Basically, this town during the tourist season is busy, and during the off season is very quiet, very small. People come here to get away from their past. In the beginning of this book, a detective shows up to investigate the discovery of a body part that has washed up on one of the glaciers out here. Is this a more nefarious thing? Has somebody murdered this person, or is this just one of those body parts that washes up sometimes after somebody's in a boating accident or jumps off a bridge? That is the question the detective is trying to ask. She arrives in this town and then gets trapped there when an avalanche closes the only route out. There is a rotating cast of narrators, very quirky small town vibes, but in this very cold, icy, isolated setting. Loved it for about 150 pages. Some very Twin Peaks vibes, which I was really digging. Then our main character abuses her badge, abuses her power in the name of doing good, except for she wasn't doing good. I really like detective fiction, even when the cops in those books aren't necessarily being the best of versions of themselves. I like it when things get complicated. I like it when there are moral choices and questions, and when cops aren't always on their best behavior and they have to kind of face the consequences of their actions. I like stories like that. That's not what happened here. What happened here is that our main detective is basically built up as a hero. She's here trying to solve a mystery. She is here trying to help the people of this town. And then she ends up going to a neighboring village that is populated by mostly indigenous native population of Alaska, and basically breaks into somebody's house and starts shooting up the place without a warrant, with no real reason. She thinks she has a reason. The reader is told there is a reason, but it's not a very good one. At that point, I kind of started to lose my faith in her as a character, as a hero. There was no real moral discussion of what she had done, she and her partner had done. It just was kind of brushed off as like, well, these people are bad people. I mean, they weren't doing great things, but also in the moment, they weren't doing anything bad. They were being suspected of doing something bad, and I just really had a problem with that. I read this for my mystery book club, and other people did not notice this or did not have the same problem, so it's probably definitely a me thing, a personal thing. At that point, I just kind of lost interest in the entirety of the rest of the story. I no longer cared about her or her choices or why she was doing the things she was doing. I just was really frustrated with how the author decided to unfold that series of events, and then I just no longer cared about what was going on in the story. Most disappointing read of February. Okay, enough with the books that I didn't like last month. Let's talk about the books that I did like. That is way more fun to talk about, honestly. There is one book that is a little bit, I am kind of putting it on the fence. I don't know if I could say I liked it, but I think for the genre, it stands really well. And if you like this specific type of genre, this book is a good addition to the books that are already out there in the genre, and I think it would be a good one if you like this genre. So you have to like the specific genre in order to like this book, I think. This is a serial killer mystery thriller. Serial killer thriller, kind of a mix of both. It is a mix of both the serial killer thriller genre and a police procedural. We have a cop who, again, this book is set in Alaska. I read a couple of Alaska books last month and a couple of World War II books last month, so some themes carrying on throughout the month. This one is set in Alaska and features a detective who is his mother was Japanese and his father was like Irish. He is dealing with kind of this identity of who he is and how he fits into this community. He is also a practicing Buddhist, which is kind of an interesting thing for a cop to be. And his name is Beans, which I love. He's also named after a plane. I cannot quite remember his first name. De Havilland Beans. People call him Beans. He is investigating the disappearance and then murder of several baristas, young women in this town who work at coffee shops, at drive-through coffee shops, go missing, and he is investigating their murder. And then you also, in the style of serial killer thrillers, get points of view from the victims. And so that's why I think I'm saying that you have to kind of like this genre in order to go into this book. If you are not vibing with serial killer thrillers right now, this book is probably not going to be your thing. It does a lot of things typical to the genre in terms of violence, in terms of building fear and building suspense. There is also at the end a very distressing animal scene. Spoiler, the animal is fine at the end of the book, but for several pages, I'm sitting here thinking that this very good dog has died, and I'm very mad about it. So I'm very glad that the very good dog did not die in this book. Again, if you are looking for something that is cozy or kind or warm, this is not going to be the book for you. It's very cold, set in a very cold climate with people who have very cold hearts. But I do think that the main character, Beans, was really engrossing. He is captivating to me. I did enjoy his point of view and spending time with him as he investigated the case. This is another pick for the Edgar Awards. I probably went into too much detail in this video, but whatever. I'm sure that by the time I get around to posting the Edgar video, you will have forgotten all about what I read. But if you are looking for a serial killer thriller, a police procedural, this is a pretty good one to pick up. I did enjoy it for the genre. It wasn't necessarily what I was looking for last month in terms of reading taste. Very solid with plot, very solid with characterization. Yeah, just a pretty solid book to add to the genre. Absolutely switching gears now away from mystery, almost. We have one more mystery novel to talk about before we move into the other genres. But this one is a bit of a mix between science fiction and mystery. This is The Deep Sky by Yume Kitasei. This is a book that is set in space, mostly. There are some chapters in here set on Earth. It involves a group of young people who are going on this grand experiment. They have all been chosen for their various abilities, knowledge, prowess, to go from Earth, which is obviously falling apart because of climate change and war, and take themselves and some samples to Planet X, where they are planning to repopulate the planet and try over with this whole Earth experiment. They are in a deep sleep for about 10 years. They wake up and then they start their process of getting pregnant. The whole experiment is to try and repopulate a new planet. I felt very kind of about that part of the book, but it did drive a lot of the conversation around community and individualism and whether or not it is a good idea to go into space, or should we be staying on planet Earth and trying to solve our problems there. When they wake up from their deep sleep, they go out on a spacewalk to fix something, and an explosion happens, and several of the crew members are killed. And that kicks off a bit of a frenzy, a bit of an investigation. Obviously, they're floating in space, and someone is trying to kill them. That's utterly terrifying. We kind of go back and forth as well with this book in terms of timeline, where we follow the people who are on the spaceship as they are chosen for this experiment, for this program, and the things that they had to go through to become a part of this experiment. So it was just a really interesting kind of social commentary on group dynamics and social experiments, and also some climate fiction ideas being thrown around in here. I think what was most poignant to me about this book was kind of the way that you watch the characters grow from these very individualistic, isolated people to realizing that they need to work together in order to get through not only the terror of there's a murder in space, but also the next journey in their life as they go to Planet X and what that means for them. This was a really intriguing read and very different than anything that I have read this year, at least. I just really enjoyed kind of the blend of the two genres of sci-fi and mystery, and also the very literary style of writing that we got in this book. It gave me, at least, a lot to think about and a lot to chew over. It was just a really solid read for February. The other World War II novel that I read was At the Water's Edge by Sara Gruen. This is a book that I've had on my shelf for a really long time. I grabbed it from the library bookstore many, many years ago. I think my aunt recommended it to me a long time ago too. I finally got around to reading it, and I was just really very blown away by this book that on the surface seems very kind of light and fluffy. 3 Americans, young Americans, 2 of them are married, and then the third guy is like their best friend who hangs out with them. He's very much a third wheel. They're just having a ball in America during World War II. They are running around to parties, getting drunk off their butts. Rich kids having the time of their life. They go to this party where they get drunk and they're making all these big promises. One of the guys, the man that the main character is married to, his father went to Scotland to try and look for the Loch Ness Monster, and I guess the history is that his father faked a bunch of photos and lied about actually seeing the monster, and so everybody kind of makes fun of this guy and his family, and he, drunk, says, I'm going to go to Scotland just like my dad did, and I'm going to prove that there's a Loch Ness Monster there. You just try and stop me. These 2 young men are not fighting in the war. They both have medical issues that keep them out of the war, and so they're kind of looked down on. People are just not really impressed with them. You know, they're these rich kids who have somehow gotten out of fighting in World War II, and so they are feeling a little bit emasculated, and they're like, okay, let's go to Scotland and let's prove ourselves. We're gonna prove that the Loch Ness Monster is real, and they drag this poor woman with them. She's not a poor woman, she makes her own choices, but at the beginning of the book, she is kind of just this, she floats around with them. She's just kind of there. What is her purpose? What is she doing? She doesn't really know. And they go on this horrible boat ride across the Atlantic, which is terrifying, and everybody's throwing up and it sounds awful. They arrive in Scotland and are faced with the realities of war. Just really got interesting from there, where you have this kind of juxtaposition of these 3 Americans who have been staying out of the war and not really paying attention, to suddenly this community that many people have died from this community in Scotland. There are air raids, there are German planes flying over, they're at risk for their lives. And it was a really interesting book to watch our main character grow as she kind of discovers the realities of war, the realities of monsters, and who she is and the choices she has made in her life. Kind of develops this new sense of self, this new identity, and really begins to stand up for herself in her own relationships. There were a few things at the end that kind of threw this book off the rails a little bit, but I still really liked it. I think that there was a little bit of a supernatural element that felt out of place with the rest of the historical aspects of it. Ultimately, I really latched on to our main character and her growth and the things that she went through and the way that she changed and the relationships that she developed. I have memory on my camera again, so we can finish up talking about the books that I read in February. I have one more novel and one nonfiction book that I want to tell you about. The Unseen World by Liz Moore was a particular favorite of mine last month. I read this to meet the Buzzwordathon challenge for Skyline. Lovely little Skyline here. And wow, was this a book that I needed in February. It is definitely a slow burn type of book. It is a character-driven type of book. It is a family saga featuring a young girl. She starts out the book being, I think, like 8 or younger, and her father, who is a scientist who is kind of out there. He's a little bit quirky. He kind of keeps to himself. And something is kind of happening to him at the beginning of this book, something that our main character doesn't really understand. Something is happening to make him be less like himself. And we kind of follow this family saga, this girl as she grows up. It's definitely a coming of age book, but it is also just intertwined with these ideas of who we are, who we feel other people are, the stories that we tell ourselves about other people versus the reality of who they are. It was just a really interesting portrait of a family during a certain era. I think this book starts out in the 70s. Maybe. And they are working on computers and that kind of technology building in that era, and specifically on AI, which was really interesting to read. I think this book came out about 10 years ago. Definitely before all the chat GPT and AI drama that is happening currently. But it was still really interesting to kind of dive into the idea of how AI might be useful. It feels a little nostalgic at this point, given that we have jumped ahead in time and now kind of understand a little bit more about the particulars of the AI that we have built and perhaps the dangers that are there. But in this book, it is kind of a way to capture memory and to capture identity and to capture this sense of self that is lost as you age, as you die. I was surprised at how captivated I was by this book. Nothing much really happens, and yet so much happens. It wasn't a high stakes mystery, just this mystery of a quietly ambitious life. And it's not really a sweeping adventure novel, just kind of made up of these small moments that make the characters who they are, these little decisions that drive them to their future. It was a tangled web of identity and coming of age and what technology might be able to do, how it might affect us, how we might affect it. It was a story about memory and about love and about disappointment, like how we disappoint people, but how other people disappoint us, but how we can still find love and beautiful moments in those disappointments. It was just a really very moving book for me for last month. Some of the tech does feel outdated because it is 10 years old, but overall, just a really strong story about interpersonal relationships and fathers and daughters and what makes a person good and how you find a place to fit in a world that is always changing and always judging, how you become yourself in this world. That's what this book is about. In some ways, it reminded me of Gabrielle Zevin's Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, which is, I feel like this is like the fourth or fifth time I mentioned that book. It was one of my favorites from last year. It also reminded me a little bit of the book Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus, where you have these characters who are very much separated from like the expectations of society of what is normal and kind of stand out a little bit, which I really enjoy reading about. I think the themes were a little bit different between Lessons in Chemistry and The Unseen World, but there was a little bit of like echoing in terms of how the characters behaved and how they kind of stood out in their scientific fields. I really enjoyed this one. I really thought it was a very powerful book, and I'm very excited that I finally got to read it. It's been on my shelves for forever, and I finally plucked it off, and I was very impressed. The last book I want to talk to you about is Transgender History: The Roots of Today's Revolution by Susan Stryker. This is a book that I read on audio, listened to as an audio book. It is read by the author, and the name just kind of speaks for itself. It is a history, not exhaustive, but there's quite a lot of information in here about transgender community, the hard work that has been done in the past, the hard work that continues to be done in today's society, the hard work that needs to continue into the future to fight for and protect the rights of transgender people. This went through early decades of the transgender revolution movement and moved into like the counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s, the feminist movement, the gay rights movement as well, and how the transgender community came into play with that. It talked about groups and individuals as well that made an impact on the movement for transgender rights. It really showed, I think, a very good overview of where the transgender rights movement started and where it's headed, and the changes and shifts that have taken place in the conversation around transgender identity and what it means to be transgender and intersex. And I think there was a really good discussion of words and language, as well as a good discussion of the transgender community trying to find its place in a society that has really struggled to accept them into the larger community. There is this idea that if you are outside the norms of expectation, in this case a very binary expectation, that perhaps there is something wrong with you. And so I think that it was a really interesting book to start with, especially if you're not familiar with transgender identity or the history that comes with that, or the civil rights movement surrounding that. I knew a little bit when I went into it, but I definitely learned a lot from this book. I think the author did a very good job at reading it. I was engaging with the information the entire time that I was listening to it. While she wasn't exhaustive, I don't think she set out to be like the seminal textbook on transgender history. I think she was really giving an overview on her experience inside the United States of America transgender community. There were definitely some European history as well, and following not only the ebb and flow of this civil rights movement, but kind of highlighting some unique individuals inside that movement that made a really great impact. This last election cycle has me thinking a lot about how to be a better ally to marginalized communities like the transgender community, and I don't think that just reading books is good enough. I think that there has to be action, there has to be speaking out, there has to be allyship, not just I read a book about this thing. But I do think that books can be a good place to start building curiosity and empathy, and I think transgender history is a really good starting point to learn about this community, where they've been, how they've been treated, how they have been fighting for rights, for human rights, for the right to be treated with decency, equality, and respect. And kind of the headwinds that they're still up against, the headwinds that we are all still fighting for. And I think it was a good discussion too of intersectionality and trying to find a way to bring a lot of different rights movements like the feminist rights movements and the gay rights movements together, which can be challenging. And I think this book really highlighted that in a way that I hadn't really considered. This was not a granular level of detail. It does not read like a memoir. It is very much like a kind of a textbook that you would read in college. And I really enjoyed it. I really got a lot out of it, and I really am kind of pushing this book pretty hard this month. I do think that if you haven't picked up a book about transgender history and about the transgender civil rights movement, this one is probably a pretty good place to start. Again, it doesn't cover everything, but it is a good jumping off point. So I think overall it was kind of an up and down month for me. I had some books that I really enjoyed and some other books that I just really wanted to throw against the wall. I learned a lot. I felt a lot of feelings. I went on a lot of adventures. I just had a pretty good time in February, and I'm hoping that March, now that we're halfway through the month, will be even better. So far, the books I have read this month have been really good, and I can't wait to talk about them with you next month. I am going to wrap this video up here, though, and get on with my day. I would love to know what book you read in February that you loved, and what book you wish you had DNF'd at page 20. I'm gonna get out of here. This video is probably too long as it is. I will be back shortly to tell you how my progress is going with reading through my own shelves. Spoiler, it's not going very well. More on that later. Thank you so much for joining me today. Reminder to check out the Kickstarter for that Claw Machine anthology, linked below, and I will see you again soon. Thank you for watching.